Are you thinking about moving from the Windy City to the Wolverine State? Well, in this video, we're going to compare everything from pizza to housing to see about your move from Chicago to Michigan. Hello and welcome. This is the Living in Detroit channel. I am your host, Matt Talbot, local real estate broker here in Michigan, and we want to give you a rundown if you're thinking about moving from Chicago to Michigan, a little bit about comparing Chicago to Detroit, a little bit about the differences, the pizza, the music, the housing statistics. So as you're moving from Chicago to Michigan, you can have a better understanding. We have a lot of clients moving here from Chicago on a regular basis. Obviously, it's one of our closest, Midwest sister cities, Chicago to Detroit, and so a lot of people kind of bounce back and forth. So we see that quite a bit. We have a lot of clients that move to this area from Chicago. So we want to deep dive for you, give you a little bit of statistics, have you understand a little bit more. So if you're moving from Chicago to Detroit or Michigan as a whole, you can have a better understanding of what that looks like for you. So to start off, we like to start on a macro perspective. What's the overall differences? And one way to do that is comparing Michigan to Chicago or comparing Detroit to Chicago, right? So Detroit's population is 620,000 currently. Actually, it's just started to rise for the first time in 66 years, believe it or not. And Chicago's population is 2.6 million, Michigan population 10 million, Illinois population 12 million. So these statistics can be a little bit skewed when you're comparing Detroit to Chicago. Chicago's a very big area, and of course, there's a lot of different suburbs of Chicago as well too. However, when you compare Detroit to Chicago and Michigan to Illinois, a lot more people live in Metro Detroit, anything within about an hour of Detroit than you think. So Detroit's population, 700,000, right? And then when you compare it to all of Southeast Michigan, which is really over 5 million people, the difference isn't quite as vast. Of course, in Chicago, a lot more people are in the city limits, a lot more, populated right downtown. But if you compare kind of that overall Southeast Michigan community to the overall greater Chicago area, the difference isn't as great as you might think. Weather. So we talk about weather a lot on this channel to kind of compare. So if you're thinking about moving from one city to the other, you get the difference. Chicago gets 38 inches of rain. Detroit gets 33 inches of rain. I don't know, 5 inches of rain each year. It's not going to be devastatingly different, I don't think. The highs in the summer are similar in the mid 80s, and the lows in the winter are similar in the 19s to 18 degrees in the winter. So I do know Chicago's known as the Windy City. You get a little bit more lake effect, I think, wind and stuff right off of Lake Michigan there in Chicago compared to Detroit. But if you're in other parts of Michigan, that could be a little bit different. Obviously, the west side of the state also has Lake Michigan, but it is pretty cold in Chicago. I don't know. I live in Detroit. I spent a lot of time in Detroit. Spent a lot of time in Michigan. When I go to Chicago in the winter, it is definitely cold. You need that like extra scarf. Make sure you got your big coat on, all that good stuff. So just me, my personal perspectives, I think is a little bit better here in the winter compared to Chicago, but again, might be a preference-based thing. Also, the general cost of living is another statistic we talk about when comparing Chicago to Detroit. Cost of living in Chicago is 21% higher than the city of Detroit. So over 20% higher in Chicago than Detroit, and that's from bestplaces.net, kind of compares those two pieces. So if you're looking to move from the city of Chicago to city of Detroit, everything's less expensive in Detroit as a whole. Quick rundown of education comparing Michigan to Chicago. University of Michigan, in-state tuition's a lot less than Chicago's in-state tuition, $15,000 compared to $61,000 of University of Chicago. Out-of-state tuition, not terribly different. Out-of-state tuition at U of M, $53,000. Chicago, $61,000. Acceptance rate of U of M is 20%. University of Chicago is 5.4%. That's very low, I feel like. We've done a lot of these comparisons on this channel. In my head, 5.4, it must be really hard to get at University of Chicago. Student-teacher ratio, 12-to-1 at U of M compared to Chicago of 5-to-1. So that's also a big different statistic. Graduation rate is going to be similar, 90% at University of Michigan, 92% at University of Chicago. 9 out of 10 people in both colleges graduate. There's a lot of other different universities, I'm sure, throughout Illinois as well as Detroit. So we try to give kind of a general comparison there too. It's hard to find data on overall statistics. I can tell you throughout the state of Michigan and definitely in Southeast Michigan, there's a lot of different options when it comes to universities as well as community colleges as well too, as well as, some other different programs outside of the more standard college role. So for you, for your kids, whatever, as you're moving to the area, there's a lot of different options here in Southeast Michigan. I can attest to that. And if you deep dive into a lot of our videos, we talk a lot about those different options in different areas. areas. Public schools. Michigan has 705 districts, almost 1,200 high schools, and Illinois has 485 districts, about 724 high schools, and also a 10-to-1 student ratio in Illinois. So more schools throughout Michigan, which is interesting because if I scroll back up, if I remember correctly, the population is a little bit less than Illinois. So overall, more schools here in Michigan. And like I said, when it comes to post K through 12, there's a lot of different options here in Southeast Michigan and as a whole. You know, downtown Detroit has Wayne State, you have Eastern Michigan. If you go across the state, there's a lot of different options. Western Michigan University, Central Michigan University, go up to Michigan Tech up north. I mean, there's a lot of different options throughout the state of Michigan when it comes to post high school graduation degrees throughout Michigan. Up next, the music scene. This is kind of a fun one, comparing the music scene between Chicago and Detroit. Just some general comparisons here. I'm definitely not the biggest music historian of all time. I definitely listen to a lot of different music, but this is an interesting take as we compare Chicago to Michigan. So Chicago is well known for the Chicago-style jazz, and Michigan has a lot of old school jazz as well too. During the early 1900s, Detroit had a jazz boom as well too. Due to so many jazz players moving to Michigan, Detroit saw an incredible jazz music take over, making it extremely popular in the city. So a lot of old school jazz in Chicago as well as in Detroit. There's a lot of overlap as well in both cities there, and a lot of good old jazz throughout both cities. Up next, house/techno. Chicago has been known for their house music as it was created in the 70s and 80s, and Michigan, however, is known for the techno music created in the 80s. So it's kind of like this like never-ending debate, I think, in like the music scene of like where techno and different types of techno came from. But a lot of people around the world say that Detroit techno was the start of techno music, and I think that there was a lot of house music in Chicago. So different flavor there. To me, electronic music is somewhat similar. I know there's some overlaps that can't always tell the exact difference, minus like a couple of the beats. Get the idea. Okay. Venues: Chicago Music Theater, House of Blues, the Hideout. I mean, I love Chicago Music Theater. House of Blues is an awesome place to see a show. I've been there a bunch of times. In Michigan, downtown Detroit has a lot of different options as well too. The Fox, the Fillmore, Pine Knob, St. Andrews. I mean, there's a lot of different venues in Detroit as well. I know Chicago is known for music scene, a lot of different places to see music. Detroit has the same thing. So you can play at big arenas like Ford Field, Little Caesars Arena, Comerica Park outdoor in the summer, as well as the smaller venues. Like I love seeing shows at the Fillmore. Is one of my favorite places to see music. Sounds great there. A lot of places in Detroit, as I know there is in Chicago. So if you're thinking about moving to Detroit, you think you're gonna like lose out on your music scene and stuff like that, I think you'd be pleasantly surprised on the different options that you have here in Detroit to see music. And that's bigger venues as well as smaller, bars and live music. I think Detroit has a good amount of that throughout Detroit and Southeast Michigan as a whole to go see music. One of my favorite places we talk about on this channel a lot when I talk about Ann Arbor is the Arc, which is a more folk type music place if you're into that type of stuff as well too. Only about 45 minutes from Detroit, but also in your comparison from Chicago to Michigan as a whole. So if you're moving from Chicago, there's some really fun things to do here in Michigan. First that come to mind is the DIA if you're into art and museums. Over 65,000 pieces of art at the DIA, which is the Detroit Institute of Arts, over 100 galleries. And the DIA has the top 6 collections in the United States of art. It's a huge place. It's a really cool building right downtown Detroit, right off Woodward, right in Midtown, not far from Wayne State's campus. There's the Detroit Institute of Arts. Also Belle Isle Aquarium, which is located on Belle Isle. For those of you who don't know, Belle Isle is an island just off the city of Detroit. Well, it is part of the city of Detroit. I think it's also owned by the state now. But anyway, it's right off Detroit, easy to get to. You're driving from Jefferson, you cross over the bridge, you're in the island itself. And the aquarium is really, really cool. Dates back to 1904, open on the weekends. Has a collection of 7 different species of garfish. We have a video on this channel on touring Belle Isle, and Nick and I did that a while ago. That's one of our most watched videos on this channel is the Belle Isle video. Last but not least, of fun things to do here in Detroit is Greektown Casino. Is one of the oldest of the 3 casinos. So you have Greektown, MGM, and Motor City Casino. Has nearly 3,000 slot machines. So a lot of different casinos in Detroit. I mean, there's so many different other obviously items to do. I think when you're comparing Chicago to Detroit, the general theme here that I'm trying to communicate is you of course have the Chicago Zoo. I mean, there's so many different different places to check out downtown. Chicago's a great city. I love going there. It's absolutely fantastic. But I would say Detroit is very underrated, and there's other places in Michigan that are underrated as far as things to do. You have the Detroit Zoo. I mean, there's a lot of different options of things to do here in Detroit, here in Southeast Michigan, that you don't always necessarily think about compared to a city like Chicago. So that is that. Up next, one of my favorite things, pizza. Okay, real talk. We need to kind of compare Chicago pizza to Detroit pizza. Okay, so Chicago-style pizza is similar to Detroit. However, toppings go underneath the cheese rather than on top, as well as the stuffed crust, invented in 1943. The Detroit-style pizza is a deep square pizza with thick crust, invented in 1946. So both pizzas go back to the 40s, okay? I think, like, you know, they're both considered deep dish. Like, I love, like, a New York slice. I'm more of, like, a thin crust guy. But Detroit pizza compared to Chicago pizza, I think there's actually more of a drastic difference if you're talking about, like, the real difference, right? And so in Detroit, we have a thicker crust pizza. It is a deep dish, like a Jets pizza comes to mind, or a Buddy's pizza. So it's a thicker crust, and a lot of times the cheese is on top. The toppings, the cheese, and then the sauce. Okay, I know Chicago sometimes it's flipped around, but in my opinion, one man's humble opinion on pizza is, you know, Detroit's about this thick, and from my experience, Chicago pizza is about this thick. Okay, it's like a pie, like legitimately like a pie with thick crust. If you're moving from Chicago to Detroit, you already know what it's like. But I can only eat like one of those slices. Like, I like Chicago pizza. I'm not trying to razz on it, but they're so overly abundant in cheese and crust and everything that I eat one slice and I feel like I'm gonna, like, I don't know, it's just too much for me. So Detroit, the thing I like about Detroit pizza, if you like deep dish type pizza, is you can still kind of smash a couple slices. Like, when I eat pizza, I want to like eat like a pizza or like a half of a pizza. I don't want to eat like one slice. In Chicago, you know, maybe it was just like, usually I'm eating Chicago pizza after like a night of like partying or something. But that being said, is like I can only eat like one or two slices. Detroit style pizza, I can eat 3, 4, 5 slices. But they're both deep dish options. You know, Detroit to Chicago, it's kind of my comparison of pizzas when moving from Chicago to Detroit. Last but not least, one of the reasons why people tune into this channel, or the major reason why people tune into this channel, is understanding more about housing. A lot of our clients are moving from Chicago to Michigan, Chicago to Detroit, which is why we make videos like this. And so we, of course, want to compare the housing statistics as a whole. So Michigan, average price point, really in that $300 to $350 price point, with the median a little bit lower, and days on market at 29 days. Chicago is a little bit higher at that $364 price point, and average days on market is 57 days according to our statistics. So the Detroit marketplace, although a lot of people want to move from Chicago to Detroit because the homes are less expensive in Metro Detroit, the marketplace is actually moving faster. So there's days on market being less in Michigan compared to Chicago, obviously shows that homes are selling a little bit faster, although a little bit more expensive as a whole in Chicago. Price per square foot in Michigan is $177 as a whole, compared to Chicago it's $284. So the homes are much more expensive, even though the averages aren't that crazy different. Homes are selling a little bit faster overall in Michigan compared to Chicago. Obviously, if you're talking about like right downtown, or if you're talking about different parts of the city, obviously there's a lot of different variety of prices and types of homes and city living in Chicago compared to Detroit or Michigan as a whole. So a plethora of different options throughout Chicago, a plethora of different options obviously throughout Detroit and Metro Detroit as well too. I think one similarity between both cities when it comes to housing statistics and the people and all that stuff is you do have two Midwest cities, right? So in my opinion, people are very, very kind, very, very welcoming, very, very neighborly in Michigan and in Detroit. And my experience personally is the same in Chicago as well too. So if you're one of those great neighborly people, you're really good to be around, and you're moving from Chicago to Detroit, holler at your boy. My name is Matt Talbot. This is the Living in Detroit channel. We sell real estate here in Southeast Michigan. If that is you, if you're thinking about moving to the area, comment below or hit our calendar link here on YouTube and set up an appointment today about your move here to Michigan.